Hello there, how's it going? Looks like we have about 60 people with us. That's great. We have about, I think there's 450 people signed up for the emails, and there's more people who obviously haven't signed up for the emails. So I think there's probably about 500 of us doing this course together. So that's very exciting. You're not on your own. It's actually going to be very interesting when we're doing the processing room, how many people show up for that. Because if you've tested it out, it's this space where you can walk around and chat to people. But you can have a maximum of 120 people in the room. I don't think we'll get anywhere near that. I'll probably make actually an overflow room, just in case there is more than that. I doubt there will be. But it could be loud and messy whenever it happens, but it's very exciting. It's definitely worth trying. If you've not been in the processing room yet, kind of test it out, walk around, get used to how it operates. I actually jumped in yesterday and got chatting with a bunch of you. We had some really interesting conversations, and there was a certain point when it just felt like I was in the room with everybody. Right? For a while, you kind of or this little icon running around. But after about half an hour, honestly, we were all sitting on chairs and we were in a circle. We were letting other people in, and it felt very natural. So I recommend it. I'm excited about adding that to the Atheism for Lent stuff. But anyway, we'll get officially started. I'm going to clap so that I can get everything in sync. Hello and welcome to the first seminar in this Atheism for Lent 2021. Thank you so much for being part of this. Some of you I know have done it before, and others this is your first time. I am your guide. That's my job. And what I want to do every week is do a seminar that introduces the material that you're going to be encountering that week. Try and help you get the most out of it. But also in this first seminar, I want to do a little bit of a background to this course and look a little bit about how atheism and theism interact with each other. And then we'll take it from there. So, where should we start? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about dialectics. And some of you will have heard me talk about this before, but I'll try and do it in a different way that I haven't done before. A lot of us, when we think about theism and atheism, we think about there is a theism and there is an atheism. So there's kind of one of each. There are these monolithic things. And atheism is, in a sense, the negation of theism. But also sometimes we may realize and understand that there are countless theisms, right? There are theisms all around the world. There are theisms that have died out. There are theisms that haven't been born yet. So there's really an infinite amount of different theisms and different gods that we can believe in, and an infinite number of atheisms that reject those theisms, right? So an atheism always has the texture of what it rejects. Right, so you can also go, my goodness, there's just an infinite variety of what we can call regional theisms and regional atheisms. But then there's another way you can kind of approach this to try to bring these together. And you can talk about, I want to name these shapes of theism and shapes of atheism. And what I mean by a shape of theism is a type of thinking about God that encapsulates hundreds or thousands and countless actually existing theisms or possibly existing theisms, right? So a shape of theism is a form of theism that kind of captures like a set. It captures a whole pile of different theisms. And a shape of atheism does the same. It is a type of atheism that captures all these types of regional atheisms that you find all around the world. And I want to talk about the mature shape of a theism and the mature shape of an atheism. And what I mean by that is the mature shape of a theism is when that form of theism reaches its zenith, when it really comes to the point of a pure thought, where it's been worked over enough that it is just at a level of maturity. And it takes a long time for that to happen, thousands of years, for shapes of theism to enter into what you might call their mature phase. And then the atheism that rejects that theism, it also reaches over time its mature shape. So I want you to bear that in mind for a second. You've got the shapes of theism and shapes of atheism, and you have the mature shapes of both of these. Now, with that in mind, I want to talk about this three-step structure, this three-step dance that is central to a lot of philosophy, called dialectics. And this three-step dance is affirmation, negation, and negation of negation, right? Now, you're going to feel this three-step dance as you do Atheism for Lent. This is something you're going to learn about, but also something you're going to experience. So I'm not going to kind of jump too far ahead. My job is each week to introduce the readings, and then you'll see how this dialectics works. But there's the affirmation, the negation, and the negation of negation. So theism is an affirmation. So a theism is affirming something about the nature of reality, about how things are structured. So theism, think of that as an affirmation. The shape of consciousness is what Hegel calls his movements, and I'm kind of borrowing that terminology. So the shape of theism, that is the most classical type of theism. You could call the notion of God as a supreme being. Now, this classical notion of theism is the one that we all know today. It's the one that basically is ubiquitous. And if you're looking at apologists on YouTube, they're kind of expressing 99 times out of 100 the notion of God as a supreme being. And that is the shape of theism that we are most aware of, and that really we start Atheism for Lent with that presupposition. We don't start by delving into that, we start by presupposing it. The mature shape of classical theism might be somebody like Thomas Aquinas, right? So this ancient classical notion of God as a supreme being, that is a shape of theism that captures lots of regional theisms all around the world, where God, or the absolute, is seen as a supreme being, that we are like God. God is infinitely more powerful and smarter than we are, but God speaks and thinks and has emotions like we do. And that's a shape of theism. Now, out of that affirmation arises a negation. So this is the second step of this three-step dance. And the negation of classical theism, this notion of God as a supreme being, you could call, what could you call it? New atheism is a version of it. So new atheism is not new in the sense of these arguments actually could go way back to the ancient Greek philosophers, but it's new in the sense that it's reborn, right? New atheism is a kind of contemporary form of a critique of classical theism, right? So, new atheism is what we would call it today, which is a critique that is almost solely directed at that type of theism. It's completely interconnected, right? Though that theism and that atheism are linked. Now, another thing to mention about this before we move on to the third step is that the negation, it's better to think of it as arising out of the affirmation. So it's not that these people someone comes from outside and critiques. It's the critiques arise from some sort of failure within the affirmation, right? The more mature the shape of theism becomes, the more robust it becomes, the more questions it answers, it becomes incredibly powerful, but also eventually generates contradictions and problems that it cannot solve. So the negation is really the articulation of those contradictions that exist within that shape. And that becomes the negation, the critique, right? But then, the mature shape of atheism itself begins to exhibit contradictions and kind of tensions and antagonisms within itself. And that leads to the third step. And the third step is called the negation of negation, where the second step, which is a negation of the first, is itself negated. Right? Now, this third step, the negation of negation, becomes an affirmation, becomes a new theism. Right? And then that new theism is the next shape. It's the second shape of theism. Now, we could call that second shape God as beyond being. Right? So if the first shape is God as supreme being, the second shape is God as beyond of being, or the apophatic tradition. And it comes to maturity in someone like Anselm. Right? So that begins to grow. Now, and that, by the way, takes on all of the critiques of new atheism, right? All of the critiques of the logical atheism that was a negation of the classical theism, takes it all on board, affirms it all, goes deeply into it, but by going into it, negates it and becomes a new affirmation. But, of course, then that new affirmation has a new negation. And that negation is the new atheism. So this is the second shape of atheism. So if the first shape of atheism is, let's call it new atheism or logical atheism, the second shape of atheism we could call materialistic atheism. And this materialistic atheism basically draws out these tensions and antagonisms within the apophatic, right? So in a nutshell, you can say that the apophatic tradition brings us further and further away from the material world. So the materialist critique is a critique that says, well, yeah, you can have that God of the beyond being, but what's important is justice, mercy, having a society of freedom, of emancipation, right? So the materialist critique basically says this God is so beyond being that it's not really relevant to the task of trying to make the world a better place, whatever, right? So then you have this critique, and as that reaches maturity, that negation, then a negation of negation happens because certain contradictions arise within that. And that negation of negation becomes a new affirmation, a new theism. So what is the third stage of theism? Well, you could call it God as ground of being, right? God as ground of being is an idea that you could say reaches its maturity in someone like Paul Tillich, right? And that takes up the materialist critique, affirms it, says amen to it, but finds these contradictions that then lead to this notion of God as ground. That becomes then the new theism, which then generates a new shape of atheism, which could be described as post-structural atheism. This brings us up to the contemporary world, post-ground or post-structural theory. And then, of course, that negation is negated, and it becomes a new affirmation, which would be God as event. And then, that generates its negation. So this is the process that you're going to go along. I should say as well that although this process just is ongoing, and the truth is being part of the journey and the conversation, that it is what enriches and develops, I do think that there is I do think once you see the structure itself, that's kind of what could be called the end of history, right? That's the truth. But we won't go into that. I'm going to do seminars and that elsewhere. Forget about that. All I want to talk about and make sure you kind of feel, to some extent, get the sense of is an affirmation is a theism. It generates a negation, which is an atheism, which generates another negation, which becomes a new theism, which generates its negation, which becomes a new atheism. And I've outlined 4 shapes of theism. God as supreme being, God as beyond being, God as ground of being, and God as event. And you're going to feel this because each week is an attempt at going from affirmation to negation of negation. Right. So, as I said, in reality, this is a messy position, right? This is happening all the time. These different levels exist at all times, but you can also see it within history. I've just cleaned it up so you're going to feel it in a very, very logical way. And the first place that we're going to start, and this brings us to the first week. This is kind of technically the second week. You had a few days of kind of the foothills, but this is the first proper week that you're about to go into. And it is the critique of God as supreme being. Right, which again I think all of us have some awareness of, because that notion of God is still very ubiquitous today. So this first negation that you're going to experience, we're going to go right back to the early Greeks, and we're going to look at Protagoras, Epicurus and Seneca, right? So early philosophers who I think outline in a way some critiques that remain very pertinent today. So Epicurus has this argument that the classical notion of God is illogical, right? Protagoras has an argument that classical theism is knowing whether it's true or not is impossible. And Seneca has this notion that the classical notion of God is irrelevant. Right, so you've got illogical, impossible, and irrelevant. Right, illogical, right? That's Epicurus. Epicurus says basically you can't have a God that's all good and all loving and all powerful, and the existence of unnecessary suffering. It's a logical contradiction. And so you'll see the argument for yourself. I don't want to actually go into the arguments because you're going to encounter them. But the one is the concept of God is illogical. The other is the concept of God. It's impossible to know. We don't have the resources. We don't have the objectivity. We don't have the time. Right? I can hardly work a computer, let alone understand the nature of reality. Right? That's Protagoras going like, you just don't know. Right? You can make all of these assertions, but we just are too limited to make any kinds of conclusions. So ultimately, whatever conclusion we come to is more a reflection of ourselves than it will be a reflection of reality. And then Seneca, who's the Stoic, says that this classical notion of God is irrelevant, right? For the Stoic, it's like you want to find wisdom and peace and detachment from the world. So you don't fear the gods or anything like that. It's completely irrelevant, right? Whether God exists or not, that's whatever. It's about having this meditative, detached spirit. Right? So those are some kind of ancient critiques. But the one that I think is most important this week is Jean Meslier. Now, Meslier is not that well known. He was alive as the 17th and 18th century. And he was a French priest, and he was a priest all his life in a small parish, and he was a very good priest, and he really cared for his parishioners. He stood up against the nobles. He was a very kind of ethical individual who gave his money to the poor. But here's the crazy thing, right? Unbeknownst to anybody, every night he was writing this book called Testament, which was this searing critique of Christianity, of the existence of God, of Christ. Like this massive book that he was working on. Never talked about it. He was preaching every Sunday. He was looking after his parishioners. He was being kind. He was caring for the poor. He was doing all of that as a priest, when he was actually, you say at night, secretly writing this huge critique. And after he died, it was discovered, and it was published as Testament. Now, the funny thing is, this book is largely considered to be the first systematic description of atheism, right? The first truly rich, deep, and consistent, systematic critique of classical theism. And it's by a priest. Right? And the reason why I think that's important is because I said earlier about how the negation comes out of the affirmation, right? The best negation is the one that knows this inside out, knows the affirmation inside out, starts to encounter its contradictions and antagonisms and difficulties, and then generates the negation. And so the fact that Meslier, this committed priest, this very good priest, a very moral priest, is really the first atheist insofar as the first person to write a systematic critique of theism, is very fascinating, and he was important for people like Voltaire. But he's not that well known, but you'll see some of his work in a few days. And then I'll mention one other thinker you're going to meet this week. I think that it's also important. By the way, what I've done is, I want you to feel this conversation's been going on for thousands of years, right? This is a conversation that has been going on for thousands of years before you were born, and it will be going on for thousands of years after you've died. And you and I get to participate in that conversation, and we may even get to have an insight into its structure and where, how it operates. But I'm putting all of that conversation into 40 days. Right? It's 40 days, and I want to immerse you in it. And so each week, you are immersed in a shape of theism or a shape of atheism. And I want each week you to be immersed in a mature form of that shape. But it could be, there's hundreds of people I could have chosen. Each week, so many, but I've just chosen ones that I think will help you. And the idea is, I really hope that you're able to, ideally it would be great if you could take an hour a day, but I know for most of us that's utterly impossible. Don't worry about that. But I want us to be able to every day immerse ourselves in the shape of theism or the shape of atheism that is that week. Now, you don't have to do them in order. You can do whatever is within the week. You can do it any order you want that works for you. But each week should be done in order, right? Don't jump ahead. The people I've picked are just representatives of that mature shape. But some of them won't work for you. Some of them you'll read and you won't like. But I encourage you to try to walk in the shoes of the shape of theism or atheism that is of that week. So Jean Meslier, again, I picked for that particular reason. I also picked those ancient philosophers, Protagoras, Epicurus, Seneca, to really show how these critiques are at the very beginning of the journey of philosophy. But also then Anthony Flew. I picked Anthony Flew because, funnily enough, this is an article. Anthony Flew is a fascinating guy, right? Because I don't know if you know the story, but one of the most famous kind of analytic philosophers who was an atheist of the kind of late 20th century. So he's very famous, very well known philosopher of religion in the analytic world. And he was a very famous and outspoken atheist. Not aggressively or anything like that, very well spoken, well educated man, but critiqued classical theism. And near the end of his life, he wrote a book with an intelligent design person, and it looked like he kind of was affirming the existence of the God that he'd been fighting all his life. And it's very controversial because he was doing this when he was very elderly, and to be honest, it looked like he was suffering from cognitive decline. And actually, I have a friend who is a journalist. He was a philosopher and then became a BBC journalist, and he interviewed Anthony Flew at this time. And he said to me, the BBC, we couldn't put the interview out because he didn't make sense. He didn't make sense because he was super smart. He just couldn't structure an argument. So there's this really interesting debate, if you want to look at it, of what did he go to some sort of intelligent design kind of deist type of position at the end of his life, or was he manipulated at the end of his life? So anyway, that's beside the point. That's just a little fun story. But Anthony Flew wrote this very short paper on falsification, and it's the most famous, maybe not now, this is pre the internet, but it was the most read critique of theism in existence, right? It was like translated into 20 languages. It was massive. And it starts off with a parable that was, I think, penned by a guy called John Wisdom. But I think this is probably why it was so popular, is it's an academic philosophy paper, but it starts with this really good little parable and then uses that. And I like parables, you know that. So I've given you the parable. And I won't go into it in detail, but basically it's two people arguing about a gardener. They find this patch of clear land in a forest, and one of them thinks a gardener tends the patch, and another says, no, it's just the way it is. It's just kind of how nature has designated this. And then the first person says, no, it's definitely a gardener. And I said, well, I can't see any gardener. And the person says, well, they're an invisible gardener. And I go, okay, well, let's put up some fences to see if we can kind of like, stop this gardener. I go, oh no, the gardener can walk through fences. Oh, let's get some dogs and they can sniff the gardener out. Oh no, the gardener has no scent. And eventually the person says, well, what's the difference between your invisible gardener and no gardener at all? And I wanted to finish the week with that because I think it's a very good example of how a form, a shape of theism generates, grows, becomes mature, but it becomes mature at a cost, and the ultimate cost is its own death, right? So it kind of like answers questions, it becomes more sophisticated, and that's what, so every little attack on the theism, right? Every atheistic attack makes the theism stronger, right? The theist reacts to that, the system grows, it becomes stronger and stronger. But then at the very zenith, at the very moment of the success of that form of theism is its failure. It ultimately then completely collapses into something else. And I think that's what Flew captures. I think maybe this is why it's so important as a piece of writing, is I think it's kind of like going, okay, classical theism has battled atheism and its negations, battled it really well, but it's battled it so much that it's lost everything of value. Everything that it valued ultimately has fallen to pieces and it's done. So you're going to end with that parable, and hopefully the week will have helped you feel the death blow. And it's not even that you believe it's really dead, you don't have to believe it, but just you feel that death blow, you feel that critique. And if you really feel that in your bones, then the next week, which will be the negation of negation, you will kind of get a real sense for how that negative critique becomes an affirmation and becomes something positive, becomes a new shape of theism that will kind of generate and become bigger. Okay, so I think that's all I want to say. If you've got any questions, if you're watching this live, I'm going to look at the little chat box, so please write any questions that you've got, and I'll just have a look at that now. There's some good conversation here. It's always hard for me to find the questions from the comments. So if you want to write question and then I can look for the word question. Let's see. Tim says, I think my theism is out of shape. And that's I like that. Kate, two negatives make a positive, question mark. Yeah, so basically dialectics is a really interesting way of thinking that has sometimes people say affirmation, or they say thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And they use that term because they go, the third term kind of synthesizes the other two and kind of makes it almost kind of like a new positive. That's not quite what Hegel means by dialectics. That's why it's affirmation, negation, negation of negation. So it's not a new positive. It's not directly a new affirmation. So Slavoj Žižek uses the example of the undead with Stephen King, right? So a zombie is not alive. Alive is the affirmation. Dead is the negation. Undead is the negation of negation. So undead is neither alive nor dead, something else, something monstrous. And the reason why it's described like that is, it sounds kind of crazy to say to you, but this is what Hegel means. He goes like, you analyze something, so the theism, you analyze the shape of theism, the God as a supreme being. And as you analyze it and as you develop it, as it gets better and better and more mature, it then gets into contradiction. It then starts to fall apart, right? Then the negation comes out of that, right? Then when that becomes mature and that begins to have antagonisms, it generates an entirely new object. So it's not like a return to what was there before, and it's not a synthesis of what exists. It's like a new level entirely. You level up, if to use a computer game analogy, right? You level up, or for Hegel, you'd level down. You level down because you're getting deeper into something. So the negation of negation is a completely different shape. It's a completely different way of understanding reality, and actually that changes reality itself. Reality is understood differently. Reality is different. This gets us into difficult waters. But anyway, so that negation of negation is like and it does become, you're right, it becomes a new positive, but a positive at a deeper level. So, and that's when you're at the next level. So there's this weird moment when the negation of negation levels down into a new positive that becomes a negative. So yeah, there's a way in which you can say it's a new positive, but it's a positive at an entirely different level. Dance the three-step dialectic. Absolutely, Dave. That's it. That's what I like to think of it as a type of dance, because it is, when you look at it, it's this beautiful movement that is enriching. And you can almost think of this as a journey, but this is not the idea that the journey is more important than the destination. It's more the idea that we're on a long journey climbing a mountain, and we stop at different plateaus, and we eat our sandwiches, and we rest, and we've made progress, we've moved, we've got somewhere, and we're fitter for it, and we feel better for it, and every stopping point is wonderful, but it's only wonderful because of the amount of work that we did to get to that. I went on a mountain walk last year with some friends, and I'm not very fit, and so I enjoyed those stops along the way so much more than they did because I worked so much harder to get to those places. But it's like both of them are required. Each of these is like a stop. Each shape is like a stopping point, and then the dialectic moves on and kind of move forward. And Dave says, yeah, it's almost as if it's contradiction all the way down. Don't give away the secret ending. That's giving away the last page of the book. Ramon, if I'm saying that right, says, thank you, question. Perfect. What are the contradictions within atheism? So I mentioned 4 different shapes of theism, and I mentioned 4 different shapes of atheism. And the 4 different shapes of atheism, I called New Atheism. It's a difficult title because as long as you know, I'm not referring just to that contemporary form of atheism that you see in Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins, although it includes them. The second shape of atheism, I'm talking about the materialist critique. So I'm thinking of people like Feuerbach, Marx, even Nietzsche, Freud, right? There's that shape of atheism. The third shape of atheism, I call post-structuralist, right? That's someone like Derrida. And then, I think those are the 3 that I mentioned, and then we're kind of like into the contemporary world, and so we'll forget about that. So what are the contradictions within, say, the materialist atheism that arises out of a critique of the apophatic? Which, by the way, the reason why I put Feuerbach in there is because Feuerbach's brilliant. Feuerbach read theology better than probably anybody of his day, as well as any of the theologians. And he really understood Christian theology, and he saw himself as a friend of theology. And he basically he was saying, I'm trying to express what is the living heartbeat of theology. And he said that it is making baptismal water into real water. It's about the bread of the host becoming bread that will feed the hungry. It's about taking the blood, the wine, and making that into wine that everyone can drink. So he basically was saying that the secret heart of Christianity is a kind of emptying itself out into the world. And so his critique of the apophatic, at the sense, was kind of going, yeah, that's all great, but actually, it's all about justice and mercy and love and grace in this world. So what's the contradiction there? Well, the contradiction that someone like Tillich brings out, or the tension is kind of simply that there's a transcendental dimension within those ideas. There is a sense of justice, of truth, of beauty, of mercy. These concepts, these transcendental concepts that orient us, that we never grasp, but that grasp us, that are kind of regulative principles that inspire our action. So they're not material. Right? Justice is not something material that you find in the world. And every time you find, justice, it's not justice. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, right? If you meet justice on the road, destroy it, because it will become tyranny. Every time someone says, oh, I have justice, right? Sooner or later, tyranny is coming. There's something of a justice that is always non-material, something to come. And so that tension within the materialist position led to developments that can become a new shape of theism, which is God as ground of being. Now, it also develops in all sorts of other ways, and thinkers do not generally fall into one of these shapes of consciousness, right? Great thinkers they're never that simple. But just to kind of like draw broad boundaries is the attempt to kind of get rid of the transcendental, the kind of the non-material. The critique of that is there's actually something transcendental. Every time a painter tries to paint something beautiful, they never paint beauty because beauty is not material, but they're inspired by beauty. Every time a philosopher argues about what is truth, they can only argue because they already are standing within truth, as in the argument wouldn't make sense if there was no truth that you could come to, right? If you're arguing there is no truth, that is itself a statement of a truth. The lawyer who is always trying to be just, to try to see justice done in the courtroom, justice is never articulated. It's always this regulative principle that inspires them. So that's just one example of a potential antagonism within that kind of historical, kind of 18th, 19th century kind of materialism. Kate says, God as event is Caputo's formulation. Yeah. God as event is Caputo, and also a few others. So Caputo is kind of like the religious formless, right? So event is a notion that you find in other philosophers. But yeah, you're right. Caputo is one of the ones who really sees this notion of event as connected with theism, but so does Zizek, and they have two very different notions of what they mean by God as event. So, which is a very interesting discussion. Here's a good question. Change on your question. Change. You're always ask good questions. So let's see what this is. Why does theism have to originally be understood as an affirmation, not a negation? Right. At a very simple level, atheism, the A means kind of a negation. It's a rejection of something. So a theism is a form of making a claim to the nature of reality, and the atheism is kind of in a way the kind of showing of how that doesn't work, the showing of the contradictions, the breaking down. But you are right, because the negation of negation becomes a new theism, and the negation of negation is a type of negation, right? It's a type of, so the apophatic tradition, which is the first negation of negation, says that you can't affirm God. Every time you affirm God, you have to negate the affirmation, because God is greater than our concept of God. Meister Eckhart famously says, God rid me of God. So you're absolutely right. It's like classical theism, I would say, tries to get rid of negation, tries to negate negation, says that tries to push it out. The apophatic tradition brings negation into itself. So that's why they talk about denomination, to dename. You name God, you dename God. You speak, you remain silent. You do theopoetics. You speak words that are designed to protect what you speak of from being reduced to words. So I think that's a very important question you're asking. And yeah, I would say that as soon as we get beyond the first shape of theism, we are in very muddy waters where affirmation and negation are much more intertwined. But still, I think the dialectic works, because the apophatic does create a kind of position out of the negation. That's why it's a new affirmation, because they create a set of practices, a set of writings, a set of kind of like principles arise out of the apophatic tradition that is not merely tearing something down, but creating something. So yeah, I think it's a great question. Let's see. Oh, so Megan asks, will Jesus be discussed within this 3-step? It's interesting you say that, because I have been doing a bit of reading around with Hegel, and I'm thinking about doing a seminar on Jesus in relation to all of this. So the short answer is not really. Will Jesus explicitly come into this? Implicitly, there'll be mentions and there'll be a little bit, but I think if you're asking for like a serious engagement, not within Atheism for Lent that I can remember. However, it is something I want to do. So I will probably do that within the next few months within Paro seminars. I definitely want to do a seminar on Jesus. So in this one, implicitly it's there, but no, not to the level I think you're wanting, but I do want to do that. Samuel says, going along with unchanged to change, is this process perhaps better understood as each affirmation and negation dialectically embodying each other? Let's see. Is this process better understood as each affirmation and negation dialectically embodying each other? If I follow you right, I think what you're saying is, are these closer than it sounds? Like they envelop and enrich each other? And this is where it gets even more complicated. Right? I don't want to say, like there's an argument actually that the negation comes first. So the 3-step dance, the true order, not the order we experience. The true order is step 2, step 1, step 3. Right, and it's almost like we experience a collapse of something. That's the first thing that happens. It sounds weird when you first say it, but it's almost like. It's like whenever we're born, to become a subject is to experience separation from the world. It's not that the subject experiences separation from the world. The separation is what gives birth to the subject. The subject is the separation, right? The fact that I am me and not you, that's the birth of subjectivity. So what's weird is it starts with a failure, a collapse, and then you fantasize something that was before the collapse. And then you fantasize something that can return you to that stage. So there is an argument to say that atheism is the first step, which generates theism as its imaginary answer, and then its negation of negation. And the reason why I'm saying that in relation to your question is just how embedded and intertwined this 3-step thing is, right? The big takeaway for everybody, I think, is, and what you're saying, Samuel, is that we think of, say, atheism as outside, looking in, critiquing. It's not. There is something, it's so enmeshed in what it critiques. This is, by the way, what projection is, right? When we fight something, 9 times out of 10, we are fighting our unknown face, right? Now, if someone breaks into my house and I fight the intruder, I'm not fighting my unknown face. Somebody broke into my house, right? If I have a heart attack, I'm not necessarily at all responsible for that, in a sense if I wanted it or anything like that. But in day to day, when I'm libidinally invested in things, it's usually I'm fighting my unknown face. I'm fighting a part of myself that is repressed, that is put into the real, right? The whole idea that the monsters under the bed are actually inside you. The stranger you think is always outside the door when you're alone is not outside the door, they are inside you. And in that way, atheism and theism, they're intertwined. When you see somebody fighting theism tooth and nail, you're going to find that they're fighting some theistic part of themselves, or vice versa. They're so hate atheism, and you'll find that there is a disavowed part of themselves that is embodied in that thing they fight. So that's how dialectics works in psychoanalysis, is in projection and transference. But before psychoanalysis came along, Hegel had worked that out in relation to consciousness itself and the things that we battle. So yes, Samuel, if I hear you right, they are very deeply enmeshed in each other. And it's almost like, I mean, Hegel uses the analogy of a blossoming flower. This is what one blossoms out of the other, and it kind of grows. And as it grows and expands, and new things come out of it. But it's like that. We are not separate from the things we fight. We are immersed. That's a very Hegelian notion, is like, we do not think about the universe. We are the universe thinking about itself. Zach said, the apophatic tradition always makes me think of Beckett and his love for the Desert Fathers, for their burning illogicality. Yeah, you're good, Zach. One of the things that I've put in, I shouldn't say this is 2 weeks away, but is as a Turan, I think I might be pronouncing his name a little bit incorrectly, but Turan was the most pessimistic philosopher you could ever meet, and you would say things like, you should not commit suicide because then you will rob yourself of the joy of thinking about committing suicide, right? He has these beautiful books and these aphorisms, but he was one of the best writers on mysticism, and I think his own kind of craziness and madness and pessimism, he was one of the few contemporary people who understood the craziness, the illogicality of the mystics, kind of really got it and really appreciated it. So I think you're going to like him if you haven't read him before. I think, yeah. Okay, one more, and then let's see. Okay, 36 says, that seems like the Jungian concept of the shadow. Here's a funny thing, right? So I'm not a big Jungian. If you know me, I'm not a big Jungian. And one of my closest friends is now studying Jung. So it's who I do my podcast with. So that's going to have lots of interesting questions. However, whenever I said we fight our unknown face, that is pretty much a line from Jung. Now, it's a psychoanalytic truth. But Jung put it in this beautiful way that I was borrowing. Like, I can't remember exactly how he put it, but it's similar to we're fighting our unknown face. So there's some bits of Jung that I don't mind. And the shadow is not disconnected from this notion of, so for Jung, that shadow side in his book, Eon, for example, he's basically saying that if you're disconnected from that shadow side, you enter into all sorts of imbalance. So there's probably, you could definitely connect Jung with this to some extent, although I don't think Jung is a dialectician. I think Jung's all about balance, yin and yang, whereas what I'm articulating is all about this kind of continual imbalance that moves. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on this journey with me. I hope that was helpful as an introduction. All I wanted to take away from this is you've obviously got the dialectic. You hopefully got a sense of how that works. And then in terms of this week, just throw yourself into this critique. And if it doesn't work for you, make it work, as in, like, you find an argument that you don't think is that convincing, think about an argument that would be convincing, right? Think about really entering into this negation and really feeling it. Allow yourself to let it wash over you. Because if by the end of the week you really feel it, then it's really going to set up the next week where you feel the negation of that negation, and then you let that wash over you. So enjoy the process. Hopefully I will see some of you in the processing room on Saturday, and I'll also be here again next week.